In the book of Revelation, chapter 18 and verse 24, we read these words, "And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth." According to Revelation 18 and verse 24, Babylon the Great is held responsible for the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. The Babylon the Great, of course, is the Roman Catholic Church, or the papacy. And because they are the last leg of the awful apostasy of the devil and his followers throughout Earth's history, the papacy is charged with being the one responsible for blood being shed. You know, somebody asked me recently, they said, "Now, Bill, how do you know that the research that you have done is right? How do you know that the historians that you cite to document what you're saying, that they're correct in what they've said?" I said, the way that I do it is simply this. I find biblical principles. I find principles laid out in the Word of God. And then I say, all right, now, which historians back up and solidify and agree with that biblical principle? Revelation 18:24, in no uncertain terms, lays the wars of the 20th century and the wars of the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th, and on, Revelation 18:24 lays the responsibility of those wars and of the persecutions of people at the door of the great whore of the Mediterranean, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are there historians out there that are brave enough and courageous enough to agree with that and cite the documentation that backs up that very fact? Now, we know that World War I, that we're going to be looking at in this broadcast, in our next broadcast, we're going to be looking, God willing, at World War II. And then after that, in the following broadcast, we'll be looking at Vietnam. The First World War was fought between 1914 and 1918. Just prior to that, in 1912, of course, we saw the destruction of the sinking palace called the Titanic. $500 million went down with the Titanic in the North Atlantic waters. John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim, all wealthy Jews, all men who refused to embrace the idea of a Federal Reserve System in the United States. These three men rejected the idea, and as a result, they perished on the Titanic that fateful evening in April of 1912. In 1913, in December, about a year and a half after Titanic's sinking, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in December of 1913, thus paving the way for the Jesuit order, who was in control now of the Federal Reserve Bank, because we know that it was Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Rothschild agents that got through the Federal Reserve Act here in the United States, creating a Federal Reserve System. These three very, very wealthy families, who were all under the control of the Jesuits of Rome, got the Federal Reserve Act passed. And so the Jesuits now had their Federal Reserve Bank, their bank that they could use. They could create money out of thin air, and they could use that money to finance the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and every other skirmish that we have seen around the world. The Federal Reserve Bank has made it possible for the Jesuit order and the Roman papacy to finance all of these conflicts. And of course, 8 months after the Federal Reserve Act was passed, in December of 1913, 8 months later, the first gun was shot and World War I had begun. It was actually July 26, 1914. The heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, was in Sarajevo. As he and his lovely wife made their way through the crowded streets in an open carriage, shots rang out, and both the Archduke and his wife were dead. The people of Sarajevo were predominantly Serbian Orthodox Christians. Since 1054, nearly 1,000 years, the Orthodox Christians and the Catholic Church had been at odds with one another. 50 years prior to the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the Croatians, who are predominantly Roman Catholic, were becoming very vocal about their hatred for the Serbian Orthodox Christians. The Serbians had been and were a rival of Roman Catholicism and needed to be exterminated. Now, lest we fail to grasp this point, it was the Serbs, the Orthodox Church of Serbia, that led the onslaught of World War I. And we'll read momentarily who was behind pushing Austria to go to war with the Serbs. We find again the Serbs being a focal point. These Orthodox Christian people, they were a focal point in World War II as well. And we'll learn about that in our next tape, God willing. Then, of course, we had another conflict in the late 1990s when Bill Clinton and NATO bombed out Sarajevo and the areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on. We find that the Orthodox Serbian Christians of the area of Yugoslavia, the Balkan country, has been the target of 3 different attacks in the 20th century alone. First World War I, next in World War II, and finally in the awful battle that took place in the late 1990s. In a book by Edmund Perry called The Vatican Against Europe, on page 14, we read these words: Pope Pius X, in his hatred of the Orthodox Serbians, was continually inciting Emperor Francis Joseph of Austria-Hungary to chastise the Serbians. After Sarajevo on July 26, 1914, Baron Ritter, the Bavarian representative of the Holy See, wrote to his government, "The Pope approves of Austria's harsh treatment of Serbia. The Pope has no great opinion of the armies of Russia and France in the event of a war with Germany. The Cardinal Secretary of State does not see when Austria could make war if she does not decide to do so now." There, in true colors, Perry writes, is the Vicar of Christ, the Apostle of Peace, the Holy Pontiff, whom pious authors represent as having died of sorrow of seeing the outbreak of the war. You see, Catholic authors have put in print that Pope Pius X was crushed, was broken-hearted, that Austria-Hungary would go to war with the Serbian brethren. How sickening that history books have been written in such a sickening way to make it appear as though Pius X was sad after he had encouraged Francis Joseph of Austria-Hungary to attack and punish the Serbian Orthodox Christians. In Edmund Paris's book again on page 48 of the Vatican Against Europe, he says, one may say quite specifically that in 1914, the Roman Catholic Church started the series of hellish wars. It was then that the tribute of blood which she has always taken from the peoples began to swell into a veritable torrent. So Pope Pius X pushed Francis Joseph to chastise the Serbs. And it was the Roman Catholic Church, according to Edmund Paris, that started the war, World War I in 1914. The Pope well knew, according to Paris, that once the Serbs were invaded, the Russians, who were also Orthodox Christians, and France would come to the Serbs' aid. But Pope Pius X also realized that if they came to the Serbs' aid, Germany would come to Austria's aid. And then everyone else around the world would begin to take sides. The English, of course, would come in on the side of the Serbs, just to name one example. So from the Bavarian representative of the Pope, it is clear that the Pope realized that if Austria-Hungary crushed the Serbs, then many, many other countries would enter the fray. The papacy was thrilled to see this happen because she had other purposes other than exterminating the Orthodox rivals in the Balkans. The papacy wanted to see Russia enter the conflict. Russia, too, was predominantly Greek Orthodox. And the papacy wanted the Orthodox Christians of Russia and around the world annihilated. You see, anytime a group of people claim to be antagonistic to the papal power, they will stop at nothing to exterminate them. The Jews, down through the centuries, looking for a Messiah to come, to receive his people, the Jews, they believe. This idea smacks right at the heart of worldwide control that the papacy and the Jesuit order wants. And so through the centuries, the papacy has sought to destroy the Jewish race from the face of the earth. The Serbs are another group. The Protestants from the days of Martin Luther and beyond. The Waldenses through the centuries. The Albigenses, the Huguenots, who dared to oppose the authority of the Roman pontiff, were hunted and slain and slaughtered by the millions because the papacy looked upon them as her rival. Let's take a look at a few moments here as to why, other than the fact that the papacy wanted to destroy Orthodox Christianity in Russia, there were other purposes as well. You see, we have looked at this concept before, but World War I began something that the papacy and the Jesuits would call payback. You see, about 100 years before World War I began, Alexander I, the Russian emperor, had kicked the Jesuit order out of Russia. From R.W. Thompson's book entitled The Footprints of the Jesuits, pages 245 and 246, we read these words: "The Russian Emperor Alexander was compelled to issue a royal decree in 1816, by which he expelled them, the Jesuits, from St. Petersburg and Moscow. This proving ineffectual, he issued another decree in 1820, excluding them entirely from the Russian dominions." Interestingly enough, 5 years later, Alexander I was poisoned to death. The House of the Tsars, the Romanov dynasty of Russia, was under attack. Alexander I had done something else that the Jesuits were going to pay them back for in time, and World War I was the beginning of that payback. You see, at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and in 1815, it had been the goal of the monarchs of Europe to create a European League of Nations. But Alexander I saw right through that and torpedoed the idea. And because of that and his expulsion of the Jesuits a few years later, incurred the undying wrath of the Jesuit order. Alexander again in 1825 was poisoned to death. Now, Alexander II broke off all diplomatic ties with Rome in 1877. And Alexander II even proposed a constitution in Russia. In Arno Gabelian's book called The Conflict of the Ages, on page 85, we read these words: "Alexander II had progressed well with his reforms and had attached his signature to a constitution to be adopted by Russia. The next day a bomb was thrown at his carriage, which killed and wounded a number of Cossacks, some of his soldiers, who were accompanying the carriage. The emperor, in deep sympathy, left the carriage to look at his dying men, when a second bomb blew him to pieces." So Alexander I and Alexander II, both czars of Russia, both members of the Romanov family, had both sought to deny and reject the authority of the proud pontiff of Rome and the Jesuit order. And Alexander II had even gone so far as to encourage and propose a constitution for Russia. That was too much. And it was for that reason that Alexander was blown to bits in 1877. Finally, 40 years later, the final and last Tsar, the last Romanov to ever rule Russia, was Tsar Nicholas II. And in 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was killed, he and all his family. Never again would a hated emperor from the house of the Romanovs rule Russia, or ever again protect the Russian Orthodox Church. Payback time had come. In Avro Manhattan's book entitled The Vatican Billions, pages 120 and 121, we read, "The overthrow of the Tsarist system therefore brought with it the inevitable overthrow of the established Orthodox Church. To the Vatican, which had waged war against the Orthodox Church since the 11th century, the downfall of her millenarian rival was too good to be true. The papacy had longed for the free hand to destroy the Orthodox Church in Russia once and for all." Now let's analyze another aspect of this. Who was it that financed the overthrow of Russia and the establishment of communism under Vladimir Ulyanov, or as we know him as Nikolai Lenin? Who aided and financed these people in their takeover of Russia? From James Zatko's book called Descent into Darkness, page 111, we read, "The instruments of this new alliance between the Soviets and the Vatican were to be the Jesuits, described as the hereditary enemies of the Orthodox Church. Reportedly, there were large numbers of representatives of the Jesuit order in Moscow during the revolution." So it was the Jesuits that aided Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky in their overthrow and takeover of Russia. In Arno Gebelian's book again, Conflict of the Ages, pages 103 through 106, it says, "Among the 1,766,188 victims up to the beginning of 1922, figures obtained from the Soviet documents, nearly 5,000 priests, teachers, and nuns of the Orthodox Church were killed. 100,000 Lutherans banished. Whole villages wiped out. Thousands of churches of the different branches were demolished. And the work of destruction goes on and on and on." So those that did the dirty work for Nikolai Lenin, Joseph Stalin, it was the Jesuit order. They were the ones who aided in the establishment of communism in Russia. It was the Jesuit order that created the bloodbath under Joseph Stalin and the destruction of Protestants and Orthodox Christians from one end of Russia to the other. But who financed, who backed these small bands of revolutionaries? They had to have money and wealth. But these three men, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, they were not wealthy men. They were all living in exile. The financiers of the revolution were all to be found in the United States of America. In Anthony Sutton's book entitled Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, pages 133 and 134, we read these words. William Franklin Sands, a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had just contributed $1 million to the Bolsheviks. From G. Edward Griffin's book entitled The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 265, we read these words. In the February 3rd, 1949 issue of the New York Journal American, Jacob Schiff's grandson John was quoted by columnist Charlie Knickerbocker as saying that his grandfather had given about $20 million for the triumph of communism in Russia. So according to Anthony Sutton and G. Edward Griffin, the Federal Reserve Bank and Jacob Schiff were instrumental in sending at least $21 million to aid in the overthrow of the Romanov family and to set up communism in Russia. Who was this Jacob Schiff who contributed so much money to the Bolshevik Revolution? He was an American. He lived in America. William Franklin Sands lived in America too. According to a tape by a man by the name of Myron Fagan, Myron Fagan stated these words. Jacob Schiff came to America in the late 1800s with orders from the Rothschilds to get control of the American banking system. By the turn of the century, 1900, Jacob Schiff had mastery of the entire banking fraternity on Wall Street. You see, Jacob Schiff was a very, very key figure in the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank. As we have already seen, the Jesuit order controls the Rothschild banking dynasty. And since it was the Rothschilds that sent Jacob Schiff to America, we realize conclusively that Jacob Schiff was a Jesuit agent in America seeking to take over the entire American banking system. With that in mind, let's turn the tape over to Side 2 of Behind the Door, Part 11. We'd like to welcome you to Side 2 of Behind the Door, Part 11, a look at World War I and events transpiring at that time. As we concluded Side 1, we noticed that Jacob Schiff had sent $20 million to aid Lenin and Stalin in setting up communism in Russia. Jacob Schiff had been sent to America by the Rothschild family in the late 1800s with one major objective, and that was to take complete control of the American banking system. Jacob Schiff was instrumental in the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. Due to the fact that Jacob Schiff was sent here by the Rothschild family, and the Rothschild family, we know, is intimately connected with the Vatican Treasury and also with the Jesuit order, we can only conclude then that Jacob Schiff was a Jesuit agent, came to America to take control of the American banking system. And so here was a man living in the United States, proclaiming himself an American, and yet he was financing a power in this earth that was totally and completely the antithesis of the principles laid out in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Jacob Schiff and the Federal Reserve System is not American. It was not then, and it's not now. Alan Greenspan, just like Jacob Schiff, he is not working for the American people. Alan Greenspan is working for the wealthy bankers of Europe who are under the control of the Jesuits and the Catholic Church. Therefore, Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve System are at the disposal of the Jesuits of Rome. Jacob Schiff, in control of the entire banking fraternity on Wall Street, financing a government completely the opposite of the United States. Jacob Schiff, like Alan Greenspan today, pretended to be an American capitalist. But how could this be, and then still support an avowed enemy of America? Jacob Schiff, living in America, but his one other objective, by taking over the banking system of America, it would one day put America into such debt that through this Federal Reserve System, America could be destroyed. Schiff was working in the United States for the Jesuits, carrying out Rome's purposes. The Jesuits wanted full control of America and Russia. Then they would create a Cold War, showing the world that the two countries were at odds with each other. But in fact, the Jesuits controlled both countries and used their pretended differences to further their plans. Do you remember how in the 60s and 70s and into the 1980s that the Soviet Union built up so many armaments in this so-called Cold War against the United States, that the buildup of this incredible military machine just about left Russia bankrupt? You see, that was the Jesuits' plan all along, was to bankrupt and then destroy the Soviet Union. And now they're seeking to do that with the United States. So the Jesuits were thrilled when the Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated July 26, 1914. This would mean the crushing of the Orthodox Church in Serbia and in Russia. It would also mean payback time for the house of the Romanovs. With the Tsar out of the picture in Russia, the Jesuits would eventually take complete control. There were other goals that the Jesuits hoped to reach with World War I. Again, from Myron Fagan's tape on the Illuminati and the Council on Foreign Relations, he said all the great nations, including the United States, were war-weary, devastated, and mourning their dead. Peace was the great universal desire. Thus, when it was proposed by Woodrow Wilson to set up a League of Nations to ensure peace, all the nations jumped on the bandwagon without even stopping to read the fine print in that insurance policy. You see, one of the purposes for World War I was to bring into play a League of Nations, because if there was a League of Nations where they could all come together, by controlling that small body of men, the Jesuits could then control every country represented, and eventually they would then control the entire world politically, paving the way for the rise of a new world order with the Pope as the leader. So Woodrow Wilson, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson was a Jesuit agent, and I will show you that momentarily, as has been almost every president in the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson proposes a League of Nations after World War I. It appeared as though this League of Nations would be very, very successful. But there was one man who stopped it. At least he stopped the United States from joining it. The man's name was Henry Cabot Lodge. He was a senator. The Jesuits' plot to create a one-world governing body from which they could control the world was stopped temporarily. This prong of the Jesuits' plan had to wait another 27 years when the United Nations was formed after World War II. And that was just one reason why World War II was fought. Because with all the devastation, after 6 long bloody years of war, the whole world would cry out for a United Nations. And then the Jesuit order would get exactly what they wanted. Now, a very tragic and interesting sideline here is that at the 2000 General Conference session in Toronto, Canada, the Secretary General of the United Nations, a man by the name of Kofi Annan, was invited to speak at the Toronto meetings. He was unable to go, so he sent one of his aides. And after the man spoke in Toronto, the president of the General Conference rose up, and I'm paraphrasing. You can get the manuscript by contacting the General Conference. But the General Conference president, in a nutshell, declared that he was so happy that a representative from the UN was there. And he also stated that the Seventh-day Adventist Church recognized the United Nations as an instrument of God to bring peace in the world. That, my friends, is a very, very shocking and scary statement. Because according to history, it is very, very clear that the League of Nations and the United Nations were all devised to bring about a one-world system of government with the Jesuits controlling it. This statement by the General Conference President can only give us a clearer picture as to where this man is taking the denomination of Seventh-day Adventism. That he could call that body an instrument of God in the earth to bring peace is utterly shocking and abominable, to say the least. Before we look at yet another reason for the papacy's delight in having the First World War, I'd like you to take a look briefly at Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was controlled and dominated by Colonel Edward Mandell House. In Charles Seymour's book, The Intimate Papers of Colonel House, Volume 1, pages 114 and 115, Woodrow Wilson declared this: "Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one." Sounds like they were pretty close. In another book written by George Viriac entitled The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, pages 18, 19, and 33, we read these words: "It was House who made, for 7 long years, Colonel House was Woodrow Wilson's other self. It was House who made the slate for the cabinet, formulated the first policies of the administration, and practically directed the foreign affairs of the United States. We had 2 presidents for one. Super ambassador, he talked to emperors and kings as equals. He was the spiritual generalissimo of the administration." Viriac goes on in his book on pages 106 to 108 and states that while Wilson was running for re-election because he kept us out of the war, Edward Mandell House was negotiating a secret agreement with England and France on behalf of Woodrow Wilson that America would enter the war right after the election. So at the very moment that Woodrow Wilson is running for his second term in 1916, at that very time, House was negotiating with England and France and told them that right after Wilson was elected, America would enter the war. Finally, in G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 239, he says, Edward Mandell House had close contacts with both J.P. Morgan and the old banking families of Europe. And who were some of those old banking families in Europe that House had contact with? Obviously, the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, all papal Jesuit agents. Edward Mandell House was a tool, was an agent of the Rothschilds and of the Jesuit order. He used Woodrow Wilson as a puppet to create the League of Nations for the Jesuit order. Woodrow Wilson was nothing more than Rome's tool to do their bidding. And so we see that these attempts by Edward Mandell House and Woodrow Wilson, and then by FDR and Harry Truman following World War II, that these 2 men as well were Jesuit agents to bring America into a one-world governing body, and by so doing would destroy the sovereignty of the United States. The final reason for the war between 1914 and 1918 was to be payback for another rebellious country. That country was Germany. Germany had been the birthplace of the hated Lutherans. As close as the 1860s and 1870s, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had caused the Jesuits some very serious trouble. Twice during this time, Bismarck had led Germany, which was known as Prussia at that time, to military victories over Jesuit-controlled countries of Austria in 1866 and France in 1870. Bismarck had also outlawed the Jesuit order with the Kulturkampf law in 1872. These crimes against Rome and the Jesuits had to be repaid. Now, it's an interesting note that Otto von Bismarck twice was almost assassinated. But of course, not only would Bismarck suffer under Rome's tyranny and wickedness, but also Germany would suffer as well. And so many thousands of Germany's most precious young men were slain in the bloodbath known as World War I. Germany was also the country most affected at the end of the war. The Treaty of Versailles plundered Germany. From a book entitled The Russian Imperial Conspiracy, pages 192, 190, 196, and 201, we read these words. The German people surrendered and agreed on the promises to them through the President of the United States, acting as a spokesman of the Entente Allies. These pledges made to the German people upon which they agreed to lay down their arms were known as the 14 Points. The Treaty of Versailles violated these pledges and put the United States in the attitude of having betrayed the German people through the President of the United States. The Allies, led by Clemenceau of France, compelled them to sign the treaty at the point of a bayonet when the German people were disarmed. They gave them 5 days to accept these 14 points under penalty of a rupture of the peace treaty and a recommencement of the war. Clemenceau, the French dictator, was the one who said that when the Treaty of Versailles was signed after World War I, it was the very signing of that document that guaranteed that there would be another war 20 years later. And indeed, there was. By the early 1900s, the Jesuits held great control in this world. They controlled Woodrow Wilson and the United States government in the West. They controlled Lenin and Stalin in Russia, thus holding sway in the East. They also at that time controlled most of the European monarchs. This is the plan of the Jesuit order, to control the leaders of the world's great powers. From M.F. Cusack's book, The Black Pope, on page 106, we read these words. It is here that the tremendous power of the Church makes itself felt. It is through this Jesuit direction that statesmen are compelled to act, not for the benefit of the country to which they belong, but for the benefit of the Church which controls them. Did you hear that? Cusack says in her book, The Black Pope, that statesmen, high-ranking leaders, presidents and secretaries of state and vice presidents and governors, they are compelled to act not for the benefit of the country to which they belong, but for the benefit of their church, which controls them. It is here that matters of the most secret nature are discussed and decided. It is here that alliances are arranged and political treaties are agreed upon. If this is true, that by the early 1900s the Jesuits almost had the world in their death grip, what would we say today? It's common knowledge that the Jesuits got their one world governing body, the United Nations, set up after World War II. It is true that a Jesuit-trained president did many things to destroy our constitutional freedoms. It is true that the late 1990s saw another war in the Balkans. Many Orthodox Christians being slaughtered, and the ones left were engulfed by a pro-Pope leader. Are all the world wandering after the beast, as Revelation 13:3 declares? Are there any nations left today that have not bowed the knee to Rome? We find clearly that after World War I, the face of the world changed drastically. The Orthodox Church was weakened. The Lutherans of Germany were weakened. The strangle grip of the Jesuits in America was strengthened here and in Russia and throughout Europe. And we've read, of course, in M.F. Cusack's book, that these statesmen work not for the country in which they are ruling, but they work for the church that controls them. April 16th of 2001, an article appeared in the Washington Times. It stated this, and on this I will close. In 1960, John F. Kennedy went from Washington to Texas to tell Protestant clergymen there that he would not obey the Pope